This is the Commander's Beacon, and I'm Eric, and we're here to discuss some unconventional ways that you might build your Commander deck. So, I read about someone developing an edible food wrapper with the goal, of minimizing plastic waste. Now, this is a really noble endeavor, but you have to be curious. If you're going to eat the wrapper that your food is wrapped in, would you then need to wrap the wrapper in another wrapper to keep the wrapper clean and prevent it from spoiling so that you actually, want to eat it? This is an interesting question, but we are not going to spend any more time today thinking or talking about food wrappers. Instead, we are going to talk about the Monarch mechanic in Commander, and not just one, but 2 deck techs focused around this mechanic. So today we're talking about Queen Marchesa and Jared Carthalion, but we're really talking about Monarch. Monarch is a mechanic that was introduced in Magic in 2016 with the set Conspiracy, Take the Crown, but it was also brought back in Commander Legends with new cards featuring the mechanic. So Monarch is a designation that can only be held by one player at a time, and Monarch only exists at all in a game when it's added by one of these cards. For example, Canal Courier says when this creature enters the battlefield, you become the Monarch. So Monarch only exists once a card like Canal Courier adds it to the game, and once it's part of the game, it will remain for the rest of the game. And what happens if you're the Monarch? Well, the Monarch will get to draw an additional card at the beginning of their end step. But again, only one player can be the Monarch at a time. And if someone is the Monarch, another player can take the Monarch from them by dealing combat damage to the Monarch with a creature. So adding the Monarch to the game can provide you with some extra card draw each turn, but it can also draw attacks from other players who might also want to take advantage of that card draw opportunity. Now, I think Monarch is fairly interesting in Commander because players tend to pile a bunch of utility creatures on the board while we search for our win conditions, but Monarch encourages a little bit of friendly violence and chaos, which is what we all need, right? But let's be fair, drawing just one additional card per turn is okay, but it's not great. Especially if it comes with the conditional stipulation that if another player deals combat damage to you, not only will you lose that benefit, but that other player will gain it. So if you can't keep the Monarch status, not only are you losing out on that card draw, but your opponents are also going to be benefiting from it instead of you. So when we combine this potential drawback with the fairly mediocre payoff of getting one extra card per turn, we can see that Monarch hasn't been terribly popular in Commander. But there are some cards that provide additional benefits related to the Monarch, both from the older Conspiracy Take the Crown set and some new ones from Commander Legends. Let's go over some of those Monarch payoffs. I won't go over all of them here, I'll just mention the strongest ones. And for reference, the majority of these cards also cause you to become the Monarch when they enter the battlefield, or when they resolve if they aren't permanents, but also the vast majority of them are permanents. I won't repeat this for every single card, but I will bring it up if there's any exceptions to this rule. So, what are some of these cards that can provide you some extra benefit as long as you're the Monarch? Well, Protector of the Crown, this is a 6-mana 2/5 giant soldier that redirects all damage that would be dealt to you to itself as long as you are the Monarch. This damage prevention will prevent another player from taking the Monarch from you too, as long as Protector of the Crown can stay alive, of course. Garrulous Sycophant has a very obscure name comprised of 2 words that are not at all in my vocabulary. It's also a 1/4 human advisor that costs 2 and a black, and it causes each opponent to lose 1 life and you gain 1 life at the beginning of your end step if you're the Monarch. There's Skyline Despot. This is a 5/5 dragon that causes you to create a 5/5 red dragon token at the beginning of your upkeep if you're the Monarch. There's Palace Jailer. This is a 2/2 human soldier that exiles a creature when it enters the battlefield, and that creature doesn't return to the battlefield until an opponent becomes the Monarch. This means that even killing the Palace Jailer won't bring the creature back, And the only way to bring that exiled creature back is for Palace Jailer's controller to lose the Monarch. And if you have, maybe you can blink Palace Jailer, for example, and have it exile multiple creatures. And again, the previously exiled creatures won't return to the battlefield just because Palace Jailer is left. There's Regal Behemoth, which causes all of your lands to tap for 1 additional mana, again as long as you're the Monarch. So this is essentially a conditional land mana doubler on a body. There's Archon of Coronation. This is a creature that causes you to not lose life when you take damage. Now this is phrased oddly, but it basically allows you to lose the Monarch if a creature hits you in combat. You just won't lose life from it if you were the Monarch when you got hit. And finally there's Dawnglade Regent. This is an 8/8 elk that costs 7 mana, 5 and 2 green. It gives all of your permanents hexproof as long as you are the Monarch. Now, Commander Legends also introduced a set of Monarch-focused court enchantments. Now, these all provide you some benefit at the beginning of your upkeep, and that benefit is bigger as long as you're the Monarch. Court of Ambition costs 2 and 2 black, and at the beginning of your upkeep, it causes each opponent to lose 3 life unless they discard a card. But if you're the Monarch, they'll lose 6 life unless they discard 2 cards. Court of Bounty costs 2 and 2 green, and it lets you put a land from your hand onto the battlefield during each of your upkeeps, but if you are the Monarch, you may instead put a land or a creature onto the battlefield from your hand. Court of Cunning costs 1 and 2 blue, and it lets you choose any number of target players to mill 2 cards at the beginning of your upkeep, but if you are the Monarch, those players each instead mill 10 cards. There is Court of Grace, which costs 2 and 2 white, and it gives you a 1/1 white spirit token with flying during your upkeep, or again, if you are the Monarch, you would instead get a 4/4 angel token with flying. Court of Heir is the most expensive of these for some reason. At 3 and 2 red mana, it lets you deal 2 damage to any target at the beginning of your upkeep, but if you are the Monarch, you get to deal 7 damage to any target instead. So the black and red courts can help you finish off opponents directly, while the green and white ones can help you generate overwhelming board presence to help you win through combat. If you're playing a mill deck, the blue court can technically help you win, but usually milling your opponents will just help them out by putting cards in their graveyard that they can recur, so I'm a bit hesitant about this one. That said, if you're playing self-mill, you can target yourself with the blue Court of Cunning. Nonetheless, I think this is the one that's least generically good, and it will require a specialized deck before you want to include it. Now, there's a few other cards that reward you as a triggered ability when you become the Monarch, or alternatively punish your opponents when they take the Monarch status from you as a triggered ability. Custody Lich, for example, has a triggered ability that causes target player to sacrifice a creature whenever you become the Monarch. Marchesa's Decree is an enchantment that causes a player to lose 1 life whenever they attack you or a planeswalker you control. This occurs whether you're the Monarch or not, so it sort of discourages people from trying to take the Monarch from you if you have it. Knights of the Black Rose causes an opponent to lose 2 life and you gain 2 life when they become the Monarch, if you were the Monarch at the beginning of the turn. And of course, Queen Marchesa herself generates a 1/1 black assassin creature token with Death Touch and Haste at the beginning of your upkeep whenever you're not the Monarch. There is Azure Fleet Admiral. This is a 3/3 human pirate that can't be blocked by creatures the Monarch controls, so it can easily get the Monarch back if you lose it. And Emberwild Captain is a 4/2 Djinn pirate that costs 3 and a red, and whenever an opponent attacks you while you're the Monarch, it deals damage to them equal to the number of cards in their hand. So this can really prevent some players from taking the Monarch from you, especially those players who are really successful at drawing cards, since they'll take a bunch of damage when they do. That said, if someone has 20 cards in hand, they probably don't really want the Monarch anyways, but this guy can still be decent if, a bit unpredictable for deterring attackers. Now, one final point about all of these Monarch payoffs. Some of these trigger during your upkeep, like the courts from Commander Legends, while some give passive benefits or trigger at your end step, like Regal Behemoth or Garrulous Sycophant. Remember that you can only become the Monarch during your combat phase by dealing combat damage to a player who happens to be the Monarch. So with this latter group of payoffs, You can gain their benefit pretty much during any turn that you can take the Monarch from another player, even if you weren't the Monarch when the turn began. With Regal Behemoth, for example, even if you're not the Monarch as the turn begins, you can attack the Monarch, deal combat damage to them, and become the Monarch. Then, during your post-combat main phase, Regal Behemoth doubles all of your mana from your lands. But when a card triggers during your upkeep, like Court of Bounty, it means you'll need to keep the Monarch through each other player's turn, so you'll need to prevent every other player from dealing combat damage to you in order to benefit from the strongest effect on Court of Bounty. Payoffs like these are going to be much harder to maintain, so you'll need to keep that in mind when you're building around Monarch. So while some of these additional Monarch payoffs are pretty decent, and again I'm thinking mostly about the Court enchantments, they're not necessarily reliable. And again, to get the strongest benefit, you'll need to prevent other players from dealing combat damage to you so that you can be the Monarch during your upkeep. And even once you meet all of these conditions, I'm not really sure that the payoffs are all that strong. Rather than trying to squeeze as much benefit as possible out of these courts, I think you'd have a lot more success just playing a Shrines deck, for example. Let's compare Court of Ire to Shrine of Rage. The Shrine deals damage during each of your upkeeps without any additional requirements. It might be hard to reach the damage output of Court of Ire at its best, since you'd need 7 shrines to do 7 damage, but it should be relatively easy to get at least 3 or 4 shrines. There's Sanctum of Fangs. This is another shrine. It causes each opponent to lose X life, and you gain that much life at each of your upkeeps, where X is the number of shrines you control. So with only 3 total shrines, this will generally outperform Court of Ambition, again, unless you can hold on to the Monarch. So my point is not necessarily that you should just build a Shrines deck, but rather that, as cool and interesting as Monarch is, it won't be enough to win us games on its own, even if we can keep the Monarch the whole game, even with the new support cards added in Commander Legends. So we'll need to use Monarch as a support towards another game plan. So first, let's decide how we're going to do that. So Queen Marchesa and Jered Carthalion True Heir are the only creatures that can be your commander and grant Monarch, but that doesn't mean we should necessarily build a Monarch deck around them. Since we're going to need to use the Monarch to support some other strategy, it might make sense to build a deck around another commander and use the Monarch support cards like Custodial Lich to add Monarch to the game. But first we need to know a little bit more about Monarch. How many Monarch cards are there, and in what colors? There are currently 29 cards in the game that grant Monarch. Of those, 19 are creatures, 7 are enchantments, 1 is a land, and 1 is a sorcery. Black and white are the most represented colors, each having 9 cards that grant Monarch. Blue and green each have 7 cards, and red has 5 cards, and not counting the multicolored cards. Only 2 of those cards are multicolored, and they're the ones we just talked about, Jered Carthalion and Queen Marchesa. Now, the other thing to note is that these Monarch cards are fairly expensive. The average CMC of these cards that grant Monarch is 4.71. So I'm actually a bit concerned here, because Monarch will only, at best, if I keep the Monarch the whole game, Monarch will draw me 1 card each turn. So getting it into the game early is important. Let's say, for example, that a commander game lasts 12 turns. If I introduce Monarch on turn 4, and I keep the Monarch all game, I will get to draw 7 cards from it over the course of the game. That is on turns 4 through 11. This is, I think, a decent payoff, but what if I introduce Monarch, for example, on turn 8? Then I only get to draw 3 cards from it over the course of the remainder of the game. And because the average card that introduces Monarch costs 4.71 mana, it usually will be, on average, turn 4 or 5 before I can introduce Monarch to the game, at the earliest. But before I can do that, I need to get one of those Monarch cards into my hand. Now, if I'm not running Jered Carthalion or Queen Marchesa in my command zone, then I'll need to draw a card that has Monarch on it. So if my goal is to cast a Monarch card reliably every game on turn 4, how many Monarch cards will need to be in my deck if I don't use Jered or Queen Marchesa in the command zone? Well, if I want, for example, a 90% chance to see a Monarch card by turn 4, I'll need to have 19 cards in my deck that grant Monarch. You'll notice that this is actually impossible for any 2-color deck. You will need to have at least 3 colors to even have access to 19 cards that grant Monarch. And even when you do this, in a typical deck, 19 cards represents about 30% of the non-land cards in the deck, and we just concluded that Monarch alone will not win games. So can we afford to dedicate 30% of our non-land cards just to adding Monarch to the game, while we'll still need another win condition? And it actually gets worse. A lot of these Monarch cards are bad, like Crown Hunter Hireling, a 4/4 that costs 5 and can't attack unless defending player is the Monarch. Like Staunch Throne Guard, a 2/5 artifact creature with vigilance that costs 5 mana and does nothing else other than give you the Monarch when it enters the battlefield. I really don't want to dedicate 19 cards in my deck to high CMC garbage cards like this. And even worse, once I've added Monarch to the game, drawing another Monarch card is often useless. Yes, maybe if I've lost the Monarch to another player, I can spend 4, I can cast Palace Sentinels to regain it, if I can't profitably get in for combat damage against the Monarch. But at this point, I'm essentially paying 4 mana to draw a card, deploy a vanilla overcosted body, and paint a target on myself. And this is not a good deal. You do not want to be in this position. You are not winning that game. So this is a long-winded argument against playing a Monarch-focused deck, unless our commander has Monarch on it. And again, only Jared Carthalion and Queen Marchesa do this. Because with these commanders, we can choose to run only the best Monarch payoffs, like the court enchantments, but we'll still reliably be able to introduce the Monarch to the game as early as possible. So, we've discussed the Monarch mechanic, and we've made the argument for who we might want to consider to lead the deck. We still need to decide, though, how are we actually going to win the game? And how can Monarch support that strategy? Well, look, we're already, I don't know, 10 minutes into this video. It's supposed to be a deck tech, and we're not even talking about the decks yet. So I will spare you my decision process and just get right into the deck strategy. And for this deck, we're going to be playing an Auras deck with a Goad sub-theme. And there's several reasons that we can use these themes along with Monarch to generate synergy and hopefully win the game. First, let's talk about Goad. Goad is a mechanic that forces a creature, typically an opponent's creature, to attack during their next combat step, but a goaded creature can't attack the player that goaded it unless there are no other options. There's 2 benefits to this for our strategy. First, a goaded creature can't attack us to steal the Monarch, and secondly, of course, that goaded creature will be forced to attack our opponents, which will help us to pressure our opponent's life totals. And because we'll be relying on combat to win games, forcing our opponent's creatures into combat will help us get there. Now, there are currently 15 cards in all of Magic that feature Goad, and almost half of them are in red, so if we're playing around with Goad, we'll want red in our deck. Fortunately, both Queen Marchesa and Jared Carthalion give us access to red. But why are we focusing on auras? Well, there's also a lot of useful auras and enchantments that help us deal combat damage or retain powerful blockers to help us keep the Monarch. And there are some powerful auras that can force, or at least encourage, our opponent's creatures to get into combat. The Impetus cycle, for example, is a series of 5 auras, 1 in each color, that goads the enchanted creature. Put these on an opponent's creature, and not only will it be unable to take the Monarch from you, it'll also be forced to swing at your other opponents. Shiny Impetus, for example, goads the enchanted creature, it gives it +2/+2, and it gives you a treasure token whenever it attacks. Now there's also the Vow cycle of enchantments. Again, 1 in each color except for black, which has 2 for some reason. Vow of Malice, for example, gives the enchanted creature +2/+2 and Intimidate, and that creature can't attack you or planeswalkers you control. Now this isn't quite as good as Goad, since it doesn't force the creature to attack, but it does at least keep that creature away from you. And you can always put either of these auras, either the Impetus cycle or the Vow cycle auras, on your own creatures for that added combat ability if you need to. Finally, perhaps the best Monarch payoffs are those court enchantments, which are, well, enchantments. So there's a lot of enchantments that support our game plan, so I've decided to lean into this enchantments and auras theme and give even more synergy to it. But we'll get into specific synergy cards in a bit. But with all that out of the way, I think we've got a viable game plan. We're going to use Monarch for card advantage and other possible payoffs with the courts. We're going to keep Monarch by goading our opponent's creatures and powering up our own creatures with auras, and we're going to kill the table by forcing combat among our opponents while adding damage from our own creatures in combat. And we'll use an enchantment and auras package and synergies to fuel our hand and keep our strategy going. But we still need to decide who's going to lead the deck. And our options again are Queen Marchesa and Jared Carthalion True Heir. I guess it's finally time for us to talk about these two. Queen Marchesa is a 3/3 human assassin with Death Touch and Haste, because assassins make the best dictators, right? She costs 1 red-black-white and gives you the Monarch when she enters the battlefield. She also has, at the beginning of your upkeep, if an opponent is the Monarch, you create a 1/1 black assassin creature token with Death Touch and Haste. So if an opponent takes the Monarch from you, you'll be able to pester them each turn with these little 1/1 Death Touch creatures to help you get it back. And Jared Carthalion is a 3/3 human warrior who's also a part-time model and personal trainer. He costs red, green, white, and when he enters the battlefield, target opponent becomes the Monarch, and you can't become the Monarch this turn. He also has, if damage would be dealt to Jared Carthalion while you're the Monarch, prevent that damage and put that many +1/+1 counters on him. So Jared gives us another condition to meet before we can become the Monarch. First, we need to take that Monarch status from another player. So that's not great, but our deck is built around combat, so it shouldn't be too difficult. Now, Jared's ability to prevent damage to himself while he's the Monarch and convert that damage into +1/+1 counters is interesting, but honestly I don't think it's all that strong. We'll use a few synergies with it, like Blasphemous Act, which will put 13 +1/+1 counters on Jared if you cast it while you're the Monarch, but we won't focus on it too much. Mostly in our deck, Jared is just a vessel to add Monarch to the game. So Queen Marchesa will give us Monarch much more readily, but Jared gives us access to green instead of black. And if we're playing around with auras and enchantments, having access to green will generally give us much better synergy and payoffs than black will. So I couldn't really decide which of these two deserves to sit on the throne. So like any good mediator, I decided to make them share it, and now they're both mad at me. But you can learn from my mistakes. I'll cover deck techs for both Jared and Marchesa, and you can pick whichever one you like best. Speaking of deck techs, it's about time we started getting into the actual deck contents. Since we've talked so much about the cards that introduce Monarch into the game, let's go over the ones that we'll be using in these decks. In both decks we will be using Court of Grace and Court of Heir. These are again those enchantments that give you a bonus during your upkeep, and that bonus is bigger if you are the Monarch. If Jared Carthalion is our commander, we can also use Court of Bounty. And if Marchesa is our commander, we will use Court of Ambition. And as far as extra Monarch payoffs go, that is all we are using. Now there are plenty of other good cards that grant Monarch, but using them would really dilute our focus on auras and on creating chaos in combat with goad mechanics. And because we have reliable access to introduce Monarch into the game right in our command zone, I chose to limit the number of additional Monarch cards in this deck to just a few of the strongest or the most synergistic pieces. So let's go over some of the other cards in this deck. First, let's talk about some of our creatures. Many of the creatures in these decks have been selected to wield auras efficiently for getting into combat, but we've got some utility creatures as well. Let's start off with our beaters. Champion of Flame is self-explanatory in an aura deck. It's a 2/2 that costs 2, it has trample, and it gets +2/+2 for each aura and equipment attached to it. If Jared is our leader, we'll also use Aura Gnarlid. This is a 2/2 that costs 3, and it gets +1/+1 for each aura on the battlefield. It also can't be blocked by creatures with power lower than its power. Now, of course, if Jared's our commander, then our color identity and our theme is perfect for the inclusion of Earl the Miststalker. If you're an Elder Commander player, then you know that this guy is a nightmare. It's a simple 5-mana 5/5 with hexproof that gets +2/+2 for each aura attached to it. Now, this is a roided out slippery bogle, and yes, that should scare you. Now, Marchesa can't play Earl, so we'll take instead Everstrike. This is a 5-mana 2/2 flyer, which won't impress your mother at all, but it does get +2/+2 for each aura attached to it. And you can pay X and 2 hybrid Orzhov mana to return it from your graveyard to the battlefield, but when you do, you must put an aura with CMC X or less from your hand onto the battlefield attached to Everstrike, and if you don't, you have to exile Everstrike. So it's got conditional recursion, evasion, and it gets bigger for each aura on it. Now, despite Mother's glaring disapproval, I actually like Everstrike, even though it's a bit janky. But let's be real, it's no Uriel. Now, there's also plenty of creatures that synergize with our auras. Rayav Mastersmith, for example, gives each of our enchanted or equipped creatures double strike until end of turn whenever they attack. Halvar, God of Battle, is even better in that it gives our enchanted or equipped creatures double strike all of the time, and it's also an MDFC that can be cast as an equipment. That's Sword of the Realms, which costs 2, equips for 2, and gives the equipped creature +2/+0 and Vigilance, and if the equipped creature dies, you return it to your hand. So we're not too focused on equipment in this deck, but you may choose to cast Halvar as Sword of the Realms for some added resilience in a removal-heavy game. Speaking of resilience in a removal-heavy game, there's also Umbra Mystic. This gives totem armor to all of your auras attached to permanents that you control. This means if that permanent would be destroyed, you will instead sacrifice an aura that has totem armor to prevent that permanent from dying. So again, this will really improve our resilience. We've got Tiana, Ship's Caretaker, which is some more resilience, though admittedly it's overcosted. This is a 3/3 flying angel with first strike that costs 3 white-red. And it says whenever an aura or equipment you control is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, you return that card to its owner's hand at the beginning of the next end step. So this is kind of like Feather the Redeemed, but for 2 more mana, with 1 less toughness, and far poorer recursion since Feather recurs instants, which can be cast and recurred during each player's turn, while the auras that Tiana casts typically won't go into the graveyard right away, and they can typically only be cast during your turn. So much worse than Feather, incomparable really, but Tiana does synergize with our plan. Finally, Wylith Soul of Steel is a 2/2 that costs 1 red-white. It has trample, and whenever it attacks, you draw a card for each aura and equipment attached to it. Now this is some awesome card advantage, although Wylith is a bit fragile and probably won't live very long. And then we've got some creatures that are also enchantments for even more synergy. Alseid of Life's Bounty, for example, is a 1/1 with lifelink that lets you pay 1 and sacrifice it to give target creature or enchantment you control protection from the color of your choice until end of turn. This can help you get past blockers, for example, to steal the Monarch, or of course it can protect your things from targeted removal. If we're running Jared, we'll also use Destiny Spinner. This is kind of obvious, since we're an Enchantments Matter deck. This is a 2/3 that costs 1 and a green. It prevents your enchantment and creature spells from being countered, and it's a late game mana sink that lets you animate your lands into creatures. Now, bestow creatures are especially useful here. These are creatures that can be cast as a creature, or they can alternatively be cast as an aura, typically at a significantly higher mana cost. And if the creature enchanted by the bestow creature leaves the battlefield, causing that aura to fall off of it, it will instead become a creature. So this does give you some added resilience against board wipes and targeted removal. Eidolon of Countless Battles, for example, is a 0/0 bestow creature that costs 1 and 2 white. It gets +1/+1 for each aura and each creature you control. It can alternatively be cast as an aura for its bestow cost of 2 and 2 white. And then it gives the enchanted creature +1/+1 for each aura and creature you control. Now, if Marchesa is our commander, we'll also run Herald of Torment. This is a 3/3 with flying that causes you to lose 1 life at the beginning of your upkeep. It costs 1 and 2 black. Now, this 1 life per turn tax is pretty much negligible for the value that this thing provides, especially since it can also be cast as an aura for its bestow cost of 3 and 2 black. And then the enchanted creature gets +3/+3 and flying. Now, if Jared is our commander, we'll use Hopeful Eidolon. This is a 1/1 with lifelink that costs white, and it has a bestow cost of 3 and a white. And if it's an aura, the enchanted creature gets +1/+1 and lifelink. Now, we've got more creatures to go over too, but let's cover some of the auras in our deck first. Now, we're using two general types of auras in this deck. On one hand, we'll use auras to buff up our creature's combat potential and to protect them. On the other hand, we'll use auras as removal or to force our opponent's creatures into combat. Let's start by talking about the auras that protect our own creatures or buff them in other ways. Now, unlike equipment, if you put 3 or so auras on a creature and someone kills that creature, you'll be at a pretty massive card disadvantage. So playing with auras is inherently risky. So I've chosen to focus heavily on these cheap recursive auras with only a few of the bigger game-ending powerhouse auras in this deck. For example, Escape Velocity and Sentinel's Eyes. These only cost a single mana and they can be recurred with the Escape mechanic. This lets you cast them from the graveyard by exiling 2 cards from your graveyard and paying its escape cost. This is 1 and a red for Escape Velocity and white for Sentinel's Eyes. Escape Velocity gives +1/+0 and haste, which is great for catching our opponents by surprise. Sentinel's Eyes gives +1/+1 and vigilance, which lets us attack and save blockers to protect our Monarch. Griff's Boon gives the enchanted creature +1/+0 and flying, and we can pay 3 and a white to return it from our graveyard to the battlefield, attached to a target creature at sorcery speed. Now, if Marchesa is our commander, we'll also use Demonic Embrace. This is a brutal recurable aura that gives the enchanted creature +3/+1 and flying. It costs 1 and 2 black, but you can also cast it from your graveyard by paying that mana cost in addition to discarding a card and paying 3 life. We'll also use a series of auras that return to our hand whenever they go to the graveyard from the battlefield. This usually happens when the creature they're attached to is killed, but it also protects those auras from being hit by a targeted non-exile based removal too. The most notable of these can be seen in the Jared deck. Rancor is a single green, it gives the enchanted creature +2/+0 and trample, and it returns to your hand if it's put into the graveyard from the battlefield. This is an amazing card, and it is amazing in this deck. Jared also gives us access to Aspect of Mongoose, which gives the enchanted creature Shroud. It's also recurable, just like Rancor. Note that Shroud here will prevent us from putting more auras on the enchanted creature, so make sure you put all of your other auras on whatever creature you want before you put Aspect of the Mongoose on it. Spirit Loop is a simple recurring aura that costs 1 and a white, and it gives the enchanted creature, whenever this creature deals damage, you gain that much life. Now, for most intents and purposes, this is lifelink, but there are a few differences that are a bit too tangential to discuss here. But again, just like the others, Spirit Loop comes right back to your hand whenever it's put into the graveyard from the battlefield. I also want to point out here that the Marchesa version of this deck is running Gen Arcanum Weaver, and this makes perfect sense. It's an enchantment deck, and it's in the Mardu color identity. Just for reference, Gen lets you pay red, white, black, and tap him, and sacrifice an enchantment to return an enchantment from your graveyard to the battlefield. So you can sacrifice any of these self-recurring auras like Spirit Loop or Sentinel's Eyes to get any other aura or other enchantment from your graveyard straight back to the battlefield. And that Spirit Loop will just go right back to your hand so you can reuse it. Now, Gen is going to do work in any enchantment-themed deck, but these particular auras will make Gen amazing in this deck. Now, although I really like these recurable auras, we're still running a few of the powerhouse auras that'll really bump up our killing power with our creatures. Ethereal Armor costs a single white, and it gives the enchanted creature +1/+1 for each enchantment we control, and it grants First Strike too. All the Glitters costs 1 and a white, and it gives the enchanted creature +1/+1 for each artifact and enchantment we control. And then there's Unquestioned Authority, and this doesn't buff our creature's power, but it does give it protection from creatures, and this means unblockable. So this ensures we'll get in for combat damage and take the Monarch if we've managed to lose it somehow, or just bash someone with a really big Jared. But not all of our auras are meant for our own creatures. Let's talk about the forced combat focus of this deck, starting with the auras. So the Impetus enchantments are probably the most synergistic way to force our opponents to hit each other. These will trigger most of our enchantment synergies while goading the most threatening opposing creature on the board. So we'll run as many of these as we can. Martial Impetus costs 2 and a white, it goads the enchanted creature and gives it +1/+1, and when that creature attacks, it buffs each other creature that's attacking one of our opponents by +1/+1 until end of turn. We already mentioned Shiny Impetus. This costs 2 and a red, it also goads, and it gives the enchanted creature +2/+2, and when it attacks, we get a treasure. Now, if Marchesa is our commander, we'll also get Parasitic Impetus. This also costs 3 mana, it gives the enchanted creature +2/+2, and when that enchanted creature attacks, that creature's controller loses 2 life and we gain 2 life. Now, I chose not to include the green impetus, that's a predatory impetus, for the Jared deck, since the mana cost for this one is a bit more than I'd like to pay at 5 mana. Now, there's also the Vow cycle of auras that can protect us from individual creatures, but they don't goad, so they won't be forcing our opponents into combat, though they can certainly encourage it. All of these auras cost 3 mana and prevent the enchanted creature from attacking us or our planeswalkers. Not that we have any planeswalkers. So we'll run Vow of Lightning in both decks. This gives +2/+2 and first strike to the enchanted creature. And if Jared's our commander, we'll also get Vow of Wildness. This gives +3/+3 and trample for 3 mana. That's a pretty good deal. And remember, we can also put these auras on our own creatures for some added punch if we don't need to use them on an opponent's creatures. And I don't run any of the other vows. Since they don't goad, they won't necessarily punish my opponent's life totals. So I've chosen to focus more on goading and better removal that we might have access to. But we do have plenty of other ways to force our opponent's creatures into combat. A Bloodthirsty Blade is an equipment, but it goads, so we'll take it. This costs 2, it equips for 1, and it gives the equipped creature +2/+0 and permanent goad. Note that we can only equip it to creatures our opponents control. A Curse of the Nightly Hunt is an enchantment, so it triggers our enchantment synergies, and it also forces the cursed player's creatures to attack each combat. But they're not goaded, so they can attack us if they want to. And of course, we'll need to run Disrupt Decorum. This is the classic sorcery for 2 and 2 red that goads all creatures we don't control. This can end games, and it's hilarious. Of course, we've also got creatures that encourage our opponents to fight it out. Fumiko the Lowblood is a 3/2 samurai that costs 2 and 2 red. It says creatures your opponents control attack each combat if able. It also has Bushido X, where X is the number of attacking creatures. This means Fumiko gets +X/+X until end of turn whenever she blocks or is blocked. Bassandra Battle Seraph is a 5/4 angel that costs 3 red-white. It lets you pay red to force another target creature to attack this turn if able. And it prevents players from casting spells during combat. Now, Bassandra is the ultimate instigator. Or it would be if Marisi, Breaker of the Coil, didn't exist. Now, Marisi can only be played in the Jared deck, but it is wonderful there. Marisi is a 5/4 cat warrior that costs 1 red, white, green. It says whenever a creature you control deals combat damage to a player, goad all creatures that player controls. And just like Bassandra, it prevents players from casting spells during combat. Except, actually, Marisi only prevents your opponents from casting spells during combat. You still get to cast spells. Marisi is amazing. I definitely considered Marisi as the leader of this deck, though I eventually decided against it since I really wanted to add Monarch to the game reliably, and I didn't want to play a ton of bad Monarch cards. But Marisi is still really cool and deserves a spot in the 99. Finally, we've also got Geode Rager. This is perhaps a bit overcosted at 6 mana, a 4 and 2 red. It's a 4/3 with first strike and landfall. When a land enters the battlefield under your control, you goad all creatures target player controls. We're not a landfall deck, we're not going to be triggering Geode Ragers several times per turn, but it does still give us decent repeatable access to goad, so I think it's worth the include. Now, before we move on, I want to mention a couple of additional pieces of removal we're using. I'm not going to go over the basic single target removal on board wipes here, but you can see the deck lists in the description for the full details. So we've got Soul Snare. This is an enchantment that costs white, and we can pay white and sacrifice it to exile a creature that's attacking us or a planeswalker we control. I like this because it directly tells our opponents not to try to take our Monarch. If I were to hold up instant speed removal in my hand, for example, my opponent might still choose to attack me because they don't know what I have. Soul Snare directly and efficiently encourages our opponents not just to avoid attacking us, but probably to send that attack somewhere else if it's profitable for them. Now, I also want to mention Temporal Isolation. This is an instant speed enchantment-based removal. It's an aura that costs 1 and a white. It has flash, and it gives the equipped creature shadow. That means it can't block or be blocked except by creatures that have shadow. Most of this time it just means it can't block or be blocked at all. Temporal Isolation also prevents all damage that would be dealt by the enchanted creature. So as long as we're benefiting from playing auras and other enchantments, I really like Temporal Isolation because it triggers all of our enchantment synergies, but because of that flash we can use it as instant speed removal. Okay, so I've been using the words enchantment synergy for a while now. We've mentioned some enchantment synergies that mostly focus on combat and auras, but let's talk about some more general purpose enchantment synergy in our card draw and mana ramp. Okay, so again, we'll get some of our biggest enchantment payoffs in the form of card draw. And the card draw and the mana ramp are where the Marchesa and the Jared decks will diverge the most. And that's probably because many of the best synergies are in green. And this means Jared has access to them while Marchesa doesn't. We'll often substitute for slightly less efficient enchantment synergies in Marchesa, but in some instances, especially for mana ramp for example, we'll have to rely on some non-enchantment based pieces. So in the Jared deck, we'll play Argothian Enchantress, Enchantress's Presence, Satyr Enchanter, Secession Champion. These are all green enchantment deck staples that draw us a card whenever we either cast an enchantment or have one enter the battlefield. Secession Champion notably can also hold auras and attack well since it gets a +1/+1 counter whenever an enchantment enters the battlefield under our control. Marchesa has generally poorer options here. We'll run Hateful Eidolon, which draws us a card for each aura we control on a creature as that creature dies. This is very conditional, and it won't necessarily give us cards when we need them the most. Otherwise, we'll run Phyrexian Arena and Underworld Connections. These both let us draw a card and lose 1 life once per turn. They don't really synergize with enchantments at all, even though they are enchantments themselves. Fortunately, there are a few Enchantress effects in white to help Marchesa out. Both decks will run Core Spirit Dancer and SRAM Senior Edificer. Both of these draw us a card whenever we cast an aura. And for the Marchesa deck, we'll also run Mesa Enchantress, which is a 0/2 that costs 1 white, and it draws us a card whenever we cast an enchantment spell. Now, Mana Ramp will also be a whole lot less synergistic in the Marchesa deck. Jared, for example, gives us access to almost completely enchantment-based efficient Mana Ramp. Font of Fertility, Mana Bloom, Omen of the Hunt, to name a few. Mana Bloom is very cool, by the way. This is an enchantment that costs X and a green, and it enters the battlefield with X charge counters on it. You can remove a charge counter to add 1 mana of any color, but you can only use this ability once per turn. And at the beginning of your upkeep, if Mana Bloom has no charge counters on it, you return it to your hand. So you can put mana into Mana Bloom as you cast it to build up mana for the next turn, but you can also just cast it for 1 mana, that is with X = 0, just to get a cheap card draw trigger from your Satyr Enchanters or your Secession Champions, and then it'll go back to your hand at the beginning of your next upkeep to do it all over again. We're also running Nessian Wanderer, which I really like to help us get a limited form of synergistic card draw. This is a 1/3 Satyr creature that costs 1 and a green, and whenever an enchantment enters the battlefield under our control, we'll look at the top 3 cards of our library and put a land from among them into our hand, and we put the rest of those cards on the bottom. Now, for the Marchesa deck, we'll run Land Tax. Now, this card is good. It's also $30. But let's talk about Lithoform Blight and Oath of Lieges to finish out our enchantment-based mana ramp for Marchesa. Now, Lithoform Blight isn't actually ramp, it's more or less a form of mana fixing. Now, this is an aura that costs 1 and a black and it enchants a land. When it enters the battlefield, we draw a card. Then the enchanted land loses all abilities and land types, and it gains tap and pay a life to add 1 mana of any color. So again, we can enchant one of our own lands to help us fix our mana, but I also like this because we can use it to enchant an opponent's land, like Gaia's Cradle, as sort of a form of land removal. Now, Oath of Lieges will help us keep up with other players who might be ramping more than us. It says, during each player's upkeep, if that player controls fewer lands than target opponent, that player may search his or her library for a basic land card and put it into play, and then shuffle their library afterwards. Note, of course, that this helps any other opponent who's behind on lands too. Since we're lacking green in the Marchesa deck, we're also running a few other conditional land ramp cards that help us keep up with most of the rest of the table. Verge Rangers is a 3/3 that costs 2 and a white, and it has first strike. It lets us look at the top card of our library at any time, and we can play land cards from the top of our library if an opponent controls more lands than us. Now, I like that this creature has first strike, so we can also suit it up with auras for combat if we need to. And Knight of the White Orchid fills the same role. It's a 2/2 that costs white, and when it enters the battlefield, if an opponent controls more lands than us, we search our library for a plains and put it onto the battlefield. And again, it has first strike, so it holds auras pretty well. Finally, let's talk just a little bit about our mana base. So I'll only mention the most interesting and relevant lands here, but please see the description for links to the full deck lists. First, we're running Hall of Heliod's Generosity. This taps for colorless, but we can also pay 1 and a white and tap it to put any enchantment card from our graveyard on top of our library. This is an enchantment deck, it makes sense. Now, since we care about combat, or more specifically, hitting our opponents to take the Monarch from them, or prevent them from hitting us, we'll use a few lands to help support that strategy. Maze of Ith, for example, lets us nullify a single attacker. We can tap it to untap an attacking creature and prevent all combat damage that creature would deal and receive, but we can't tap a Maze of Ith for mana, so just be aware of that. Rogue's Passage lets us get in for combat damage easily by making a creature unblockable end of turn, though it does cost 4 mana and tapping Rogue's Passage for this effect. You can also tap it for colorless mana. And then finally, Jared will have access to Kessig Wolfrun, which can also tap for colorless, or we can pay X green red and tap it to give target creature +X/+0 and trample until end of turn. So again, these are going to help us get in for combat damage so we can take the Monarch from our opponents if they've managed to steal it from us. Alright, so with all of that out of the way, let's go over the deck stats and cost. Jared's deck will set you back a reasonable $142.86 on TCG Player at the time of this recording. Marchesa's deck is a bit more at $171.68. We are running 34 enchantments in the Jared deck and 31 in the Marchesa deck. And remember again that a lot of the mana ramp and card draw in the Jared deck is enchantment based, whereas Marchesa doesn't have enchantment versions of a lot of these cards. So this light edge in enchantments to the Jared deck makes sense here. Now, of those enchantments, 21 of them are auras in the Jared deck, and 20 of them are auras in the Marchesa deck. Both decks are running 28 creatures and 35 lands, or 36 if you count Maze of Ith, but you shouldn't. Each deck has 8 pieces of ramp and 7 pieces of card draw, not counting the Monarch mechanic, of course. Each deck is running 2 to 3 board wipes depending on how you classify Disrupt Decorum, and 9 pieces of single target removal. Now, a lot of that single target removal will deal with creatures, which is intentional in the design of this deck. We want to make absolutely sure that we can hit our opponents with our creatures in combat, since that's how we win the game. And we also want to make sure that they can't hit us, so we get to keep the Monarch. So I hope I've been able to convince you to try out the Monarch mechanic in your next Commander deck. There's some pretty cool new additions to the mechanic in Commander Legends that I think really make this a lot more playable than it was before. Now again, I think Monarch is best used as a supporting strategy since it won't win you games on its own, but it can help you keep your hand filled and introduce a little bit more action into your games. But that is all I've got for today. Please like this video or subscribe if you found any of this useful. I make Commander-focused content showing you all sorts of unconventional ways that you can build your Commander decks, from budget alternatives to deck techs to top 10 lists. And thank you for watching.